And again, he has published very widely on radicalism, on the theme of radicalism and the theme of revolution in the 17th century, both revolutions, which is good to see. He's written a monograph, Loyalty, Memory and Public Opinion in England, and has also recently published an edited collection remembering early modern revolutions, England, North America, France and Haiti. The title of his talk now is Levellers and Ranters, Radical Categories and Trajectories in the World Turned Upside Down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that introduction, and thank you again, Wazim and John, for the invitation to speak at this conference. So I'm going to kick off with some remarks on the introduction to Hill's World Turned Upside Down. I promise I have read the rest of it, but this is a couple of pages. In the introduction, Christopher Hill warned against imposing, quote, too clear outlines on the radical groups of the 1640s and 1650s. The reality, Hill urged, was much more blurred, with individuals moving, quote, easily from one critical group to another, end quote. Political, religious and more general criticism, Hill said, merged, and it was unwise to attempt to differentiate starkly between these different fields. Hill also reminded his readers of the distance in time between 17th century radicals and 20th century groups. A mid-1650s Quaker, he said, had more in common with a leveller than with a member of the present-day Society of Friends. And yet, on the following page of the introduction, Hill then made a strident argument for history informed by the present. History, he says, has to be rewritten in every generation. And indeed, he went further. The levellers, he said, were, quote, better understood as political democracy established itself in late 19th and early 20th century England. So they made more sense in the 20th century than they did in the 17th. And in this paper, I want to explore what seem to be these tensions between Hill's vision of a particular mid-17th century radical milieu, as he put it, in which group and individual identities were highly fluid, and his also accompanying regular deployment of terminology which conversely was suggestive of well-defined and cohesive organisational identities. And Jason has just referred to the way in which Hill sort of focused on radicalism, seems to be focused on group identities. This paper will examine this tension through looking at one 17th century figure, Captain William Bray, who's usually associated with the Leveller movement. And while I'm going to critique some aspects of Hill's categorisation of Bray, I want to suggest that his life in general provides broad support for Hill's blurry vision of radical identities. But in line with some more recent work, I'll contend that this radical milieu that Hill identified was constituted as much by intellectual as social commonalities. Now, the Levellers do not feature that prominently in The World Turned Upside Down, and partly Hill rationalised this on the basis that their story had, quote, often been told, so thinking of works like H.N.L. Brailsford's history. Instead, the book focused on, quote, something much vaster and more inchoate, end quote, which was the connection between the Leveller leadership, its organisation, and the meaner sort, especially the rank and file within Parliament's army. Bray was an important part of this picture, as one of the officers most active, according to Hill, in encouraging radical sentiment amongst the ordinary soldiers. Bray also served to support Hill's opening observations about the overlapping nature of radical religious and political visions. Bray, Hill observed, was one of several Levellers who were also affected by the broader climate of millenarian expectation. Once again, however, we can also see Hill moving from this description of broader radical currents to deploying very specific and consciously modern labels. Bray was, he said, one of the, quote, physical force Levellers, a description which made a direct parallel, as many people will pick up here, with 19th century radicalism, namely the Chartist movement. And I should also add in here, because it's already been mentioned by John, this is actually Hill using a categorisation from the Soviet historian M.A. Barr. So it's not Hill's, it's Hill's translation of Vallance categorisation. I want to suggest here, though, that while aspects of Hill's presentation of Bray may require revision, notably his attachment to physical force, his observations regarding the cohabitation of constitutional innovation with millenarianism remain perceptive. I'll suggest that they should encourage us to consider how anti-formalism, or perhaps rather to use Mario Carriccio's formulation, supraformalism, could form linkages between the Levellers programme and those radical antinomians labelled by contemporaries as Ranters. Now a very short, hopefully, bio potted bark of William Bray. Bray first comes to prominence at the famous Putney debates of October and November 1647. He intervened in a debate on the agreement of the people on the 8th of November, countering Oliver Cromwell's claim that permitting all men to vote for their representatives would lead to anarchy. Unfortunately, William Clark, scribe of the debates, provided no detail of his response, only recording that Bray, quote, made a long speech. Thanks. Bray is best known, though, as the most senior officer to join the Leveller-inspired mutiny at Ware on the 15th of November 1647. By this point, Bray is Captain Lieutenant in Robert Lilburn's regiment. Bray's explanation for his behaviour at Ware was sufficient to satisfy the army leadership, but he was soon in trouble again, this time as one of several soldiers alleged by Henry Lilburn, his brother Robert second in command, to have argued that it was lawful to kill the king. Bray and the others accused, perhaps including the future digger William Everard, petitioned Fairfax, repudiating the accusations and demanding that Lilburn evidence his claims. Bray would later allege, in fact, that these accusations were specifically designed to destroy Leveller influence in cavalry units. Certainly, he was once again in the crosshairs of his commander. Henry Lilburn appears to have dismissed Bray from his commission sometime around February 1648. At the outbreak of the Second Civil War, however, Bray had nonetheless, on his own initiative, raised a troop to fight the Royalists in Kent, but ignored orders to join the regiment of Colonel Michael Livesey and instead attached his soldiers to the irregular forces of John Reynolds. In August 1648, perhaps as a result of this, orders were given for the apprehension of Bray. As after Ware, though, Bray seems once again to have managed to satisfy the army leadership and retained his command. But by March 1649, Bray was once again in hot water, having penned a tract in which he defended the right of soldiers to petition without the approval of their commanders, supporting the old arguments of the hunting of the foxes, a key Leveller tract most recently attributed to Richard Overton. Bray claimed that by suppressing such petitions, Fairfax had taken it upon himself to wield a power as absolute and arbitrary as that wielded by the late king. A comparison, unsurprisingly, which did not go down very well, and Bray was imprisoned for 2 years subsequently in Windsor Castle. After his release, Bray continued to engage in disputation with the Commonwealth authorities. In 1652, he represented his cornet, Christopher Cheeseman, in a dispute with the sub-commissioners for compounding for Berkshire. In the later 1650s, Bray may have moved to the Netherlands. A pass was issued for one William Bray to travel to Amsterdam in 1655. By 1659, however, Bray appears to have returned to England. With the downfall of the Protectorate, Bray argued for the establishment of a new government on the principle of the Leveller agreements of the people, debating with another former soldier Leveller, Jeremiah Ives, who argued that military government was the only way to counter the Royalist Presbyterian threat. With the restoration of the Rump, we last hear of Bray as being recommended to Sir Arthur Hazelrig for a command as one who has shown quote, constant affection to the Commonwealth, end quote. Now, this summary of Bray's career might suggest that Hill's labelling of him as a physical force Leveller was perfectly fitting. He had certainly developed a reputation as a lightning rod for mutinous behaviour. He was moved from Windsor Castle to Wallingford in 1651 on the basis that he was stirring up discontent with the garrison now at the castle. Bray was also associated with other mutineers, notably William Thompson, leader of the Banbury Mutiny in May 1649. Yet Bray's own account of his presence at Ware casts a different light on this aspect of his reputation. Bray insisted that his actions were intended to restrain the violence of his troops, who had already refused their orders to march north, and had responded with fatal force to attempts to get them to comply. Bray was also concerned that some troops were falling under the influence of popular royalist sentiment. Bray's solution was to encourage the troops to write to the agitators and seek their direction. Bray then followed Fairfax's orders in bringing the soldiers to the rendezvous at Ware. This account seemingly satisfied the Council of Officers, who permitted Bray to retain his command until Henry Lilburn's intervention the following year. As we will see, Bray showed a general opposition to the direct intervention of the army in political affairs, specifically in the case of prize purge and the trial and execution of the king. As late as 1659, in his dispute with Ives, we can find Bray quoting the French theologian Pierre Chalon that, quote, "violence doth nothing well," end quote. If Hill's description of Bray as a physical force leveller is potentially problematic, there seems to be little issue with the observation that Bray, like other levellers, was given to millenarian as well as democratic visions. As Barbara Tuff noted, his works published from 1647 to 1649 are full of religious expectation. Indeed, the dominant mode of these works is prophetic. The most extensive of these mystically infused publications was his God Magnified and Man Dethroned, published in 1647 and addressed to Parliament and the Westminster Assembly. The pamphlet was an intervention in contemporary religious debates, arguing against the imposition of the Directory as the form of authorised public worship. Overall, Bray argued for a broad religious liberty grounded on the fallibility of human judgment. As he pointedly asked the members of the Assembly, quote, "Are you as certain as Christ is certain that this is the harvest? And are you as certain that you are the reapers, that you yourselves are not the tares?" End quote. Christ had given no power to man to persecute or discipline men for their beliefs. The injunction to, quote, "give Caesar his due," for Bray clearly indicated that there were matters that were not within the power of temporal authorities. The work was studied with Latin quotations, references to the Church Fathers and to classical Greek drama, raising interesting questions about Bray's education, which I won't be able to answer if you're thinking of posing that question. Yet, Bray was clear that his argument was drawn not from human learning, but direct revelation. Quote, "The invisible God and substance has carried me out to write these things, and hath answered all objections, though many, of flesh, hell, and death, so that to me, to will and to do, is God, so that all, or anything that shall be to me, gain an immortal advantage." End quote. Indeed, the work seems to me to foreshadow the radical antinomian ideas of the later 1640s and early 1650s, employing a rhetoric of inversion strikingly similar to many works identified with the Ranter canon. And this is a lengthy quote from it. "I desired," he said, "that I might be so swallowed up to the life of the Lord, that in seeing of that Lord and the things of that Lord, I might not respect persons, and it might be all one to me to be hated and to be loved, to be honoured and to be dishonoured, to have evil report and to have good report, to be buffeted, scorned, condemned, despised, and to be counted the offscouring of the world, and to be courteously entertained, affected, delighted in, to be out of prison when I am in, and to be in when I am out, to have all things when I have nothing, and to see only that all, that eternal wise God alone when I have anything." As noted by Gary de Cray, Bray himself would later be accused of Ranterism. While acting as defence counsel for his cornet, Cheeseman, he was asked by the influential Berkshire MP and regicide Daniel Blargrave whether he was, quote, "Bray the Ranter." Blargrave's accusation may have been informed more by Bray's association with Cheeseman than by any detailed knowledge of Bray's writings. Cheeseman was connected with the circle of the Berkshire minister and English Baronist, John Portage, whose behaviour and that of his followers had led to accusations of being ranters. Bray denied the accusation, but it was a denial which also suggested that those called ranters had been misrepresented, and here the emphasis is mine. "I answered to this effect, that I knew no one in the world could justly accuse me of any such thing, and I did not know any one of the name to be so. And truly, let me say as Paul did, if I was free from sin, inwardly and outwardly, as I am from those acts of conversation that such a people are accused with, I should have no sin at all." So Bray seems to be saying here that he's not a ranter, but then neither are the other people who are described as ranters. Yet there were intellectual affinities, I will argue, as well as personal connections with Portage's circle, specifically in relation to their views on the trial and execution of the king. As has already been noted, Bray and his co-petitioners had challenged accusations that they had claimed it was lawful to kill Charles. The petition outlined a position that Bray would also maintain in his post-regicide works. It complained of those who would, quote, destroy justice and righteousness from amongst men and make a common good and equal distribution of justice to become a particular personal and selfish interest, end quote. Post-regicide, Bray recounted his horror at learning that some within the army leadership sought the king's death out of, quote, mere policy. I had, he said, an exceeding great astonishment in my spirit, and wondered this would tend unto, for I look upon mere policy to be a destructive principle, and a great dependency upon a man's own wit. Instead, Bray said that he concurred with leading independent ministers, such as Joshua Sprigg and Robert Bacon, who supported the king's trial and condemnation in law, but were vehemently opposed to Charles's execution. These views were also shared by prominent members of Portage's circle, such as Mary Pocock and the Abingdon prophetess Elizabeth Poole. As Manfred Broad has shown, their stance on the trial was grounded not in legal arguments, but contemporary occult thought, namely the belief in the chemical wedding between God and man, male and female. The marriage between king and parliament was analogous to this, and it was not for man to dissolve the union. So to conclude, because we're short on time, the contemporary labelling of Bray as both a leveller and a ranter was not, as suggest, without grounding in Bray's own writings. But I would suggest that these labels in Bray's case represent less a developing radical trajectory, so from leveller to ranter, than reflections of different aspects of his own thought. Albeit so that we can sense that this aspect of millenarian expectation does diminish in the works published after 1649. So to return to Hill's categories, if there is something anachronistic and possibly inaccurate about labelling Bray as a physical force leveller, Hill's specific and broader observations around Bray still hold. He clearly was somebody who influenced the rank and file of the soldiery. If you look at his sub-commanders, Cheeseman and Naylor, they're obviously very influenced by his works. And if we look at the petition that's produced from John Reynolds' regiment, again, it seems to show Bray's influence. But on that broader point, concerning the fluidity of radical identities in this period, I think Hill's observation remains highly perceptive and has, in fact, despite all the attacks, anticipated much post-revisionist scholarship. Where recent work has taken this further is in considering the intellectual as much as the social basis for this radical milieu. Bray's superformalism crossed political and religious spheres. Although identified as a leveller, he expressed himself as indifferent about the system of government in a state, whether monarchy, aristocracy or democracy. Nothing for Bray was essential but, quote, justice and righteousness in a common weal, end quote. Thank you.